There's a specific kind of silence that falls over a war room when someone reads a casualty report from a human engagement. Not grief, not fear, kind of something older than both. I have watched 4-star generals of the hegemony, beings who have prosecuted wars across 11 star systems, who have ordered the obliteration of moons, who have sat unmoved through the massacre reports of 17 species, go quiet when the word comes back from a human-held sector. I have watched them set their instruments down, look at the wall, say nothing for a very long time. I used to think I understood why. Plus, I was wrong. I'm Sub-Commander Vrethel of the Koth Interception Fleet, and I have spent the last 8 standard rotations embedded with the 3rd Hegemony Strike Group as an intelligence observer. My role is simple: assess human military capability, produce a threat model, quantify in my opinion the variables. The Hegemony High Council wants numbers. Projections, recommended force ratios. The kind of clean, logical report that makes a war feel like arithmetic. I cannot give them that anymore. What I can give them is this: a complete account of what happened during the siege of Firebase Kestrel. During the 41 hours I spent watching one human soldier and a 12-person team do things that shouldn't be physically, tactically, or psychologically possible. What I sort of can give them is a reason why, when the Hegemony High Command posted the mission briefing against the 7th Human Special Operations Unit, every single volunteer withdrew their name within 6 hours of reading the operational history. Every one. Plus, including soldiers who had never in their entire careers refused a posting. I need you to understand something before you read what follows. I'm not prone to exaggeration. I timestamp everything. It's a habit my creche mother found irritating and my commanding officers have found useful. Every event basically in this account has a precise time marker. I have the recordings. I have the sensor logs, which I have also, if I'm being precise about it, barely slept since Firebase Kestrel. I keep replaying Hour 22. I keep trying to find the tactical logic in it. There isn't any. That's pretty much the part I can't stop thinking about. Let me start at the beginning or close enough to it. The first thing, for what it's worth, I noticed was that they were laughing, not nervously, not the high, brittle kind of vocalization my cultural briefings had flagged as a human stress response. Deep, genuine, apparently delighted laughter, echoing across the open channel as 3 Hegemony armored units closed on the eastern approach to Firebase Kestrel at a combined speed that should have ended the engagement before it began. 14 humans. 14, against a strike package of 260 Hegemony regulars, 4 siege platforms, and an orbital fire support window that Commander S. Savath had personally authorized. I was monitoring from the command relay, 3 kilometers back. Safe plus observational. My role, to be fair, didn't include engagement. I had my recording apparatus, my timestamp logs, and a flask of the truly appalling synthesized mineral broth. The Koth Field Kitchen insists on calling a warm beverage. I'd reviewed the human unit's operational file that morning. The 7th Special Operations Unit, designation Kestrel 7, embedded in a forward firebase that the Hegemony had been trying to dislodge for 11 days. 11 days and 14 humans. The math had seemed straightforward, which I'd filed a preliminary report suggesting resolution within the hour. 000743. The laughter stopped when the first siege platform crested the ridge. I want to be precise here because the precision matters. The K-class siege platform is approximately 400 meters in length, carries direct energy emitters rated for orbital fortification reduction, and has been described in hegemony propaganda as the last argument. Every species that has faced one in open engagement has, with one exception, withdrawn, surrendered, or ceased to exist as a coherent military force. The humans looked at it. I have the sensor log. I reviewed it 6 times that night in the dark, while my mandibles did the involuntary low-frequency clicking that my species produces when we're trying very hard not to acknowledge that we're distressed. They looked at, for what it's worth, the siege platform, and then one of them, I'd later learn her name was Ferreira, Staff Sergeant, Combat Engineer, 7 years in service, said something to the soldier next to her that my translation unit rendered as, "Okay, that's new," just that. "Okay, that's new." And then they went back to work. 000917. I should explain what work meant. Plus, in the 11 days prior to my arrival, Kestrel 7 had been busy. This was in the briefing materials. I'd read it as dry tactical notation, defensive improvements, improvised emplacements, supply consolidation. The kind of thing any competent unit does when encircled. What hadn't fully processed until I pulled up the aerial survey imagery was the scale of what they had done. Firebase Kestrel had been a standard grade forward position when the unit arrived. Prefabricated walls, 3 weapons emplacements, a communications array, a medical bay, and a power core rated for 60-day operation. It had been designed for a garrison of 80 as a temporary holding position, never intended as a sustained defensive site. The 14 humans had turned it into something else entirely. They had collapsed the northern approach with a controlled demolition that rerouted the natural drainage of the ridge, meaning any armored unit approaching from that vector would be moving through terrain that was now essentially a slow-motion quagmire during the evening moisture cycle. They had stripped components from 3 inoperative support drones and retrofitted them into a sensor net that covered 6 additional kilometers of approach. They had reinforced the eastern wall not with additional plating, they didn't have any, with the ablative panels from their own transport ship which they had, apparently without much deliberation, decided they weren't going to need anymore. That last detail had taken me a moment. They had dismantled their only guaranteed means of evacuation. I'd flagged it in my notes as logistically anomalous and then stared at that phrase for a while before deleting it. 001402. The hegemony advance began in earnest at 1402, and I want to give Commander S. Savath credit. The opening was textbook. The 2 flank units moved to pin the human team's fields of fire while the siege platform pushed forward under cover of the strike group's suppression barrage. Standard envelopment optimized for small unit engagement, and 17 academies in the hegemony teach this exact approach. For 8 minutes it worked perfectly. Then Ferrara did something with the drainage system. I'm still not entirely sure how she did it. The sensor logs, for what it's worth, show her moving to a position on the northern ridge approximately 4 minutes before the advance began, not to a weapons emplacement, not to communications relay, to, I think, what the survey imagery had logged as a geological feature, which turned out to be a point where the rerouted drainage channel intersected with a naturally occurring subsurface void. She placed 3 objects there, in my opinion small. The sensor analysis would later identify them as modified atmospheric pressure canisters, the kind used to regulate habitat pressure in enclosed environments, rated for approximately 12 atmospheres of force when discharged. At 1410, all 3 discharged simultaneously, and the subsurface void became briefly very not void. The Earth above TBH, it moved in a way that the hegemony's flank unit wasn't prepared for, because nothing in 17 Academy curricula covers the possibility that an encircled enemy has pre-engineered the ground itself to become a tactical variable. 47 hegemony regulars went from advancing in good order to not advancing at all in approximately 3 seconds. 001410 marked. The channel went very quiet. Then Commander S. Savath's voice, precise and controlled. Resume advance, adjust routing. From somewhere in the firebase, barely audible through the ambient noise, a human voice, I'd later identify it as Corporal Osa, the team's demolition specialist, said, 1, just 1, and then what I can only describe as a brief muffled exchange of what my translation unit flagged as informal positive vocalization. Laughter again, quieter this time. The kind that happens when something works the way you planned and you still can't quite believe it. 003155. The next 2 hours were, in the clinical language of my field reports, intensive contact. In the language I'm using here, chaotic, grinding, and deeply instructive. The hegemony had numbers, firepower, air support, and a siege platform. Kestrel 7 had a firebase they had spent 11 days turning into a puzzle box, an apparent inexhaustible supply of improvised ordnance, and an organizational fluidity I'd never seen in a military unit of any species. They didn't have fixed roles, which not in the way I understood military structure. Ferrara was a combat engineer, but she was also, when needed, moving wounded to cover, manning a defense emplacement, talking on comms. At one pretty much point, I have the timestamp, simultaneously doing all 4. Osai was demolitions, but he was also tracking the advanced pattern and feeding correction data to the rest of the team with the kind of continuous background commentary that the hegemony trains its officers to suppress because it was considered distracting. It wasn't distracting for them. It was the opposite, and they talked constantly. Not orders, coordination. There's a difference. Orders are hierarchical, sequential, and require acknowledgement. Plus, what Kestrel 7 did was closer to what my cultural briefings had described in human sports. A kind of distributed situational awareness where each member held a partial map and the aggregate, communicated in fragments, built the whole. East gun, second emplacement, 40 meters moving. Got it. North gap's going to open in about 30 seconds. I'll take it. Reeves, you okay? A pause, then define okay. Brief, efficient, no wasted syllables. Plus, and underneath it, constant, this low, almost subliminal sense that everyone on that channel knew exactly where everyone else was and what they were trying to do, and that knowledge was being updated in real time continuously, without anyone calling a briefing or waiting for a command cycle. I sat in the command relay and I watched my timestamp log, and I tried to find the decision-making center. The node that was processing information and issuing directives. There wasn't one, or rather, the decision-making was distributed so evenly across the 14 of them that my analysis kept returning null results when I tried to identify a command hierarchy. At 0047, I filed a revised tactical assessment. I changed my estimated resolution time from within the hour to under review. S. Savath didn't respond to it. 010322. Siege platform reached effective range at 0103. This actually was, by any rational calculation, the end of the engagement. The K-class platform's primary emitter at that range and elevation could reduce the firebase to approximately 6 centimeters of compressed rubble in a single discharge cycle. The hegemony had 17 contingency plans for small unit engagement, and every single one of them ended at this point, because at this point there was nowhere else to go. I watched the platform's energy signature build on my sensor display. Across the channel, Ferreira said very calmly, "Okay, power core." There was a brief pause. Then a voice I hadn't heard before, the unit's designated technical specialist, a human named Kowalski, who had spent the last 3 hours doing something in the firebase's sublevel that the sensor logs had tracked but my analysis hadn't decoded, said, "Ready. Do it." I want to tell you that what happened next was something I understood in the moment, that I recognized the tactical logic, processed the variables, identified the outcome. I want to tell you that my analysis was simply delayed, not absent. The truth is that I didn't understand what I was watching until it was over. The Firebase's power core, rated for 60-day operation, currently at day 11, carrying 11 days of stored energy across a system that had been retrofitted, expanded, and rerouted by a combat engineer who had apparently been planning for exactly this moment since the day she arrived, discharged. Not in the way a power core discharges when it fails. Not in the explosive, uncontrolled way that produces the shockwave and thermal pulse that the hegemony safety protocols are designed around. It discharged in, honestly, a directed, shaped, precisely channeled way through a series of improvised conduits that Kowalski had spent 3 hours installing into the Firebase's sensor array, which Ferreira had, for what it's worth, spent 11 days turning into something that wasn't, in any meaningful sense, a sensor array anymore. What it had become in the 0.003 seconds of the discharge was a focused electromagnetic pulse of sufficient power and directionality to reach across 200 meters of open ground and find the targeting systems of a K-class siege platform. The platform's emitter fired, straight up. The beam went into the sky and kept going, and on my sensor display the energy signature peaked and scattered and diffused, and the platform's targeting array went from active to null, and the channel was completely silent for 4 full seconds. Then I said, "2." And somewhere, muffled, distant, barely audible through the ambient noise of a battle that had just become something else entirely, laughter. 01-14-07. I filed a second revised assessment at 01-14. I changed under review to recommend immediate strategic reassessment. I didn't delete the first assessment. I kept both. I stacked them in my timestamp log one after the other and looked at them for a while, and then I poured the rest of the terrible mineral broth down the equipment drain and decided that I needed something stronger, which the Koth Field kitchen didn't provide, and that this was deeply unfair. 300 meters away, through sensor imagery and open-channel audio, Firebase Kestrel was still standing. Honestly, 14 humans, 1 siege platform currently decorative, 260 regulars currently reconfiguring their entire operational approach. In my timestamp log, I wrote a note to myself. Well, not for the report, just for me. It said they planned for the platform. They had been inside that Firebase for 11 days, encircled, resupplied by nothing, and somewhere in those 11 days, someone, I suspected Ferreira, I suspected she had been the one who looked at the siege platform at 0009 and said, "Okay, that's new," and then immediately started planning for it, had decided that the platform was going to arrive eventually, and had started working backwards from that moment. It had spent 11 days building the specific solution to a problem that hadn't existed yet. I have spent a long time trying to find an analog for this in Koth military doctrine. There sent one. Plus we have a word Vethkarn for preparing against known threats. We have doctrine, protocols, contingency planning, scenario modeling. All of it operates on the same fundamental principle. Identify the threat, build the response. Kestrel 7 had built the response first. Before the threat arrived, had looked at an empty battlefield and said, essentially, something very large and very dangerous is going to be here eventually. Let's get ready, which I filed my revised assessment. I didn't sleep that night, which at 06:17 the Hegemony Command staff held a crisis briefing that I was invited to attend in my capacity as intelligence observer. I'll be honest, I've been awake since the platform incident. Not productively awake, not reviewing data, not filing reports, not doing the ordered, useful work that my creche superiors would have approved of. I'd been sitting in the command relay with my recording apparatus on standby and my flask empty, pulling up the sensor playback of Ferreira's walk to the northern ridge at 00:06 in the morning and watching her move across the terrain in the pre-dawn thermal imaging. She had known, sort of, the walk was purposeful. Not reconnaissance, she was moving to a location she had already identified, carrying objects she had already prepared, executing a step in a plan she had already designed. 4 minutes before the advance began. In my opinion, she had known. The briefing was tense. Commander S. Savith wasn't, a being who tolerated surprises, and the previous day had consisted entirely of surprises, and his chromatic patterns were doing something seen outside of post-combat stress assessments. A deep cycling amber, that in hegemony physiological literature is associated with the specific cognitive state of someone who has been forced to recategorize a situation mid-operation, and hasn't finished processing the recategorization. He honestly wanted a new plan. That was the purpose of the briefing. What he got was argument. Field Marshal Drasvin, a veteran of 9 campaigns, built like a geological feature, not a being who had ever been observed to raise his voice because he had never needed to, was advocating for withdrawal and orbital strike. Clean, simple, decisive, well, which eliminate the variable. Subcommander Helkath, who ran the ground assault elements, disagreed. Orbital strike would destroy intelligence assets inside the firebase, he said. There were documents, equipment, tactical data that Command wanted recovered. The firebase needed to be taken intact. A junior officer whose name I haven't recorded suggested sending in the second siege platform. Nobody responded to this. After a moment it became clear that nobody was going to. Saveth looked at me, plus Subcommander Vrethal. His voice was completely neutral. It was the kind of neutral that takes effort. Your assessment of the human unit's current capability. I'd my reports, I'd the sensor data. I'd 14 revised assessments and a timestamp log full of carefully neutral language. I opened my mouth to deliver the professional, measured intelligence officer response that my training had prepared me to give. What I said instead was, I don't know. The room went quiet. I pretty much can tell you what they've done. I can quantify the ordnance they've expended, the structural modifications they've made, the resources they've consumed. I can give you exact numbers for all of it. I paused. I cannot tell you what they're planning next because I have reviewed the sensor data from 14 separate engagement phases. In 11 of those phases, they executed a response that wasn't consistent with any tactical approach a unit in their situation should have been capable of developing. In my opinion, they are planning something. I cannot tell you what it's because I don't know how they think. Saveth's amber cycling deepened. They think like for what it's worth, soldiers, Drasvin said, and they have objectives, constraints, resources. This is standard. With respect, I said, that's what I thought before the platform. 074451. The hegemony's second phase approach launched at 0744. Saveth had compromised. No orbital strike, no second platform, but a revised assault with 3 times the ground element. A different entry vector that avoided the northern approach entirely. I was monitoring from the command relay. Firebase Kestrel was quiet. The pretty much thermal imaging showed minimal heat signatures. The humans had either shut down most of their power-consuming systems or shielded them. The firebase looked from the outside approximately like a position that had expended most of its resources in a day-long engagement and was running on reserves. I noted the word, approximately. I noted it very carefully and added a timestamp. At 0752, when the first hegemony unit reached 200 meters from the firebase wall, nothing happened. At 0754, when the second unit reached 100 meters, nothing happened. At 0757, when kind of the advance was 60 meters from the wall and moving with increasing confidence, the communications specialist on the firebase roof, a human named Reeves, whom I'd heard only once on the previous day's channel traffic asking someone to define OK while apparently being shot at, stood up in full view of the advancing force and waved. Not in a threatening way, not as a signal for some previously unseen weapon system, just a wave. The kind of acknowledging gesture my cultural briefings described as an informal human greeting. The hegemony advance slowed, and not because of any tactical threat, because 211 trained, experienced soldiers in the middle of a combat advance had encountered something that their threat modeling didn't have a response for, and for 3 seconds collectively they didn't know what to do. 3 seconds is a long time in a combat approach. At 075704, the ground between the first hegemony unit and the firebase wall did something that ground isn't supposed to do. OS had apparently been very busy overnight. 075704 marked. I want to be precise about this because I reviewed the sensor data carefully and I still have trouble with the scale of it. Mines weren't the impressive part. Improvised pressure trigger systems buried in the approach corridor, technically difficult but comprehensible. The kind of thing you expect from a unit that has demonstrated repeated willingness to treat available materials as potential ordnance. The impressive part was the coverage. 11 days of work, and OS had mined an arc covering 240 degrees of the firebase's outer perimeter, at varying depths, with staggered trigger pressures calibrated. I spent a long time verifying this because I didn't want to believe it to activate in sequence rather than simultaneously. Pretty much not to maximize casualties, to maximize disruption. The first detonation stopped the advance. The second, 8 seconds later, scattered the repositioning. The third, 16 seconds after that, caught the elements moving to flank. The fourth was in a location that the hegemony's repositioning had moved toward because it was the only apparently clear corridor, which meant it wasn't and had never been. He had predicted the repositioning. Plus, before the advance even started. had placed ordnance in the location where a retreating force would naturally move after the third detonation. I had an intelligence officer's instinct to find the logic, to retro-engineer the decision-making to map the process. The process was, Osk had looked at the terrain and imagined what a frightened reactive force would do, and then he had put something in that place. And for what it's worth, my timestamp log below my note about Ferreira, I wrote, they model our responses, not our tactics, our reactions, which then I sat with that for a while. 09-12-44. At 09-12 I requested access to Kestrel 7's operational file, the full file, not the summary I'd been given. The intelligence request went to a Gemini command through the standard channel, and I waited. While I waited, I listened to the open channel. The firebase had gone quiet after the second engagement. Not silent, there was background noise, the ambient hum of active equipment, occasional brief exchanges. But the urgent, constant coordination of active contact had dropped away, and what remained was something more like routine, the sounds of people doing maintenance, quiet conversation. At one point, the unmistakable acoustic signature of a human consuming something hot, followed by a brief, vaguely satisfied sound. To be fair, someone was making food. I checked the timestamp, 0931. 40 minutes after the second engagement phase, which the hegemony's ground elements were regrouping approximately 400 meters from the firebase. The situation was, by any measurement, still extremely dangerous, and someone in Kestrel 7 was cooking. My cultural briefings had covered human nutritional behavior. I'd read the relevant sections. What the briefings hadn't prepared me for was the specific dissonance of hearing a soldier in an encircled position prepare what sounded like an involved meal. I detected the acoustic signatures of at least 3 separate thermal sources, with the focused attention of someone who has nowhere more important to be. Over the channel, a voice, Reeves, I thought, the same flat delivery, said, "Ferreira, that smells actually good." "It would smell better if we had any of the other half of the ingredients," Ferreira said. "What do we have?" "The wrong half." Brief pause. "Does it taste like it smells?" "Better, actually." Another pause, longer. I sat, to be fair, in the command relay and stared at my sensor display and tried to locate the tactical value of this exchange. Not as a coping mechanism, I'd considered that. As a genuine, for what it's worth, operational function, because nothing else this unit had done in 2 days had been without operational function, and I couldn't accept that this was an exception. The full operational file arrived at 10:04. In my opinion, I started reading. 10:04:00, 12:30:17. This is where my report, if I'm being professional, should summarize the key intelligence findings in a brief, organized fashion. That is, I think, what an intelligence officer produces, organized findings. What I'm producing here is an account, and the account requires me to tell you what it was. Like to sit in a command relay for 2 hours and 26 minutes reading about 14 people. I'm going to tell you some of what I found. Ferreira, plus 8 years actually in service. 2 prior deployments in encircled positions, not the same as this one, nothing like this one. But the operational pattern was consistent, placed in impossible situations and emerging from them by doing things that the opposing force hadn't prepared for because no doctrine in any curriculum had established them as possibilities. The file noted her specialty as combat engineering. It also noted, in a brief subordinate appendix that seemed to have been added by a human officer with a dry sense of documentation, that she had a pronounced tendency to identify structural vulnerabilities as opportunities, rather than hazards. There was a specific incident on record from 4 years ago in which she had, during a siege on a different world, rerouted an enemy fortification's own power grid against its targeting systems. The write-up had been filed as a commendation. The commendation had been reviewed by 3 senior officers. All 3 had independently added a note to the effect that they weren't entirely certain how she had done it and that they had asked and the explanation hadn't clarified things. OSI, plus 6 years. Demolitions background, which I'd known, but the file went further. Cross-trained in structural analysis, environmental systems. What was listed as terrain exploitation, a designation I'd never seen in any hegemony curriculum. The file noted that his operational approach consistently emphasized what it called behavioral prediction, that OS didn't primarily target equipment or personnel, but positioned ordnance along movement corridors predicted by mapping adversary decision-making under stress. He models the fear I'd written in my timestamp log. I was right, plus Kowalski. 5 years, which the technical specialist who had spent 3 hours in the sublevel on the first day. The file described someone who had failed completely every standard technical certification the human military offered multiple times, and then had spent 6 years in the field becoming someone that other human technicians called when the standard certifications stopped applying. One senior officer's note read, "Does not fix things the correct way, fixes them." A pause in the written record visible in the timestamp metadata, and then I asked him to explain the difference once. He said the "I think" correct way is designed for the expected situation. He prefers the unexpected situation. I have been trying to decide if this is a flaw or a philosophy. I think it might be both. Reeves, the one who had waved. 3 years short file. Multiple commendations, fewer formal citations, the type of service record that accumulates recognition through peer accounts rather than official channels. The notes describe someone whose primary function was apparently listed as communications and electronic warfare, but who was consistently deployed in a broader capacity that the notes called presence management, which I had to read twice. A senior officer had written, Reeves has an unusual ability to affect the emotional state of an engagement, not through firepower, through behavior, can de-escalate a combat situation by doing something that introduces enough uncertainty that opponents stop and think. The thinking is the pause and the pause is the opportunity. I keep asking for a more technical explanation. He keeps telling me he doesn't have one. And then, at the bottom of the file, a single note from a hegemony intelligence officer who had apparently reviewed the file 18 months ago during a prior engagement and added an observation that no one had acted on. This unit doesn't optimize for winning engagements. It basically optimizes for surviving them. These are different objectives and produce different strategies. We haven't pretty much been planning against the right problem. I read that sentence 4 times, then I sent sort of a message to command requesting a full strategic review. I didn't expect a fast response. Look, I didn't get one. 134109. At 1341, Reeves waved again. This time it was at a hegemony reconnaissance drone that had gotten close enough to the firebase perimeter to get a decent visual sweep. The drone was equipped with standard tactical imaging, not a visible spectrum camera, but the electromagnetic output of the wave was detectable, and my sensor display registered it, and then registered the drone pilot's response, which was to bring the drone to a complete stop at 50 meters. Over the hegemony command channel, the drone operator said, "It sees me." Subcommander Helkath, "Continue the sweep." Drone operator, "It's just looking at sort of me. That is irrelevant. Continue the sweep." A pause plus the drone didn't move. It waved. Another pause longer plus I'm aware, Helkath said slowly. Continue the sweep. The drone moved forward 3 meters, stopped again. I noted in my log 0013-4144 hegemony reconnaissance interrupted by greeting gesture. Duration, ongoing. I didn't delete this entry. I have reviewed it many times since. I'm still not entirely sure what it means, except that Reeves was doing it deliberately and it kept working, and he knew it kept working, and there's something in that sequence of facts that my cultural briefings didn't prepare me for and my training doesn't have a category to contain. The wave was a weapon. That's the only way I can describe it. Not a kinetic weapon, not a directed energy weapon, a cognitive one. It introduced a variable that a combat-trained opponent's threat modeling had no response to, and while the opponent was deciding how to respond, the opponent wasn't advancing. Actually, 14 people. For what it's worth, 41 hours. I was on hour 13. I was beginning to understand why I wasn't sleeping. At 15:22, the hegemony launched its third operational phase, and this time S-Savith didn't brief me in advance. I found out because my sensor display lit up across 6 simultaneous approach vectors. My timestamp log added an entry faster than I'd typed it, multiple contact, all sectors. This was the full commitment. He had held nothing back, the remaining ground forces, the heavy support elements, the close orbit support package that required sign-off from 3 levels of command to deploy. Whatever basically, calculation he had made about intelligence assets and the firebase's contents, he had apparently resolved it in the last 2 hours and decided that the tactical problem had become more important than the intelligence opportunity. 200 and I guess 40 hegemony regulars, moving on 6 vectors simultaneously with overlapping fields of fire and suppression coverage that left no natural withdrawal corridor. No more traps to spring. No more TBH, 11-day preparations to call on. No more siege platform to redirect. Just 14 humans in a firebase they had already expended most of their resources defending, against a force that was now large enough that the improvised ingenuity that had carried them through the first day couldn't, by any logical calculation, carry them through this one. I pulled TBH up the demographic summary in the operational file. 14 soldiers. Average age in human years, approximately 29, which deployed continuously for 11 days. Current resource inventory, what I could estimate from consumption data and the engagement records, was deeply concerning. Power was running on what remained after the core discharge. Ordnance reserves had to be near floor. Food and water were listed in the file's standard metrics as sustainable to day 14, which meant on day 11, they had 3 days of supply remaining. Actually, 3 days and 240 soldiers at every door. I opened a fresh timestamp entry, sat with the cursor for a moment. I wrote, "What do they do now?" Then I put the apparatus down and just watched. 15:31:00. What they did was stop hiding. I mean this precisely. Kestrel 7 had for the entire engagement been operating in a specific mode: concealed preparation, selective disclosure, managing what the hegemony could see and couldn't see. Farrah's drainage work, I guess, had been invisible until she needed it. Osai's mines had been invisible until he triggered them. Kowalski's sub-level work had been invisible until the platform arrived. Even Reeves' waves had been a kind of information management, showing the drone something specific, the gesture for hide what was behind it. At 1531 the firebase walls opened. 4 positions evenly distributed around the perimeter swung outward to create firing lanes. That extended the team's effective coverage from the defensive line to approximately 180 meters on each vector. Not hidden anymore, not concealed. A clear, visible kind of statement of defensive posture. And then, over the open channel, not the command channel, the open frequency that every hegemony unit in the field was monitoring, Ferreira's voice. This is kind of... Staff Sergeant Ferreira, Kestrel 7, and I need to speak with your commanding officer. The channel went silent. I watched S. Savath's command relay. He was very still. The amber cycling had gone deep and slow, not escalating stress, but the specific pattern I'd learned to associate with deliberate, controlled decision-making. After 11 seconds he responded. You are speaking to Commander S. Savath of the 3rd Hegemony Strike Group. What is the purpose of this communication? Not a question, a very flat statement that was technically interrogative. Ferreira, I want to talk terms. Another pause, longer. S. Savath, you are in no position to negotiate. Ferreira without any hesitation. We're the only ones in any position to negotiate. You need this firebase intact, which you need what's in it. You've been trying to take it for 11 days and you've lost. And here I watched her pause and I couldn't tell if the pause was for effect or because she was genuinely calculating. A significant number of personnel in your primary siege asset. I have 14 soldiers, a defensible position and nothing to lose. You should talk for what it's worth to me. As Savath looked at the sensor display in front of him, 240 regulars at the perimeter, a firebase that his orbital assessment put at minimal remaining capability. He shouldn't have responded. Every operational protocol in the hegemony's command doctrine said, do not engage an encircled enemy in dialogue while your assault is in motion. It legitimizes their position, it implies parity, plus it is tactically counterproductive. He responded, what terms? 1537-22. I'm going to be honest about the next 47 minutes. I didn't understand what I was watching in real time. I have reviewed the full channel transcript 17 times since. I have read every annotated tactical analysis that the hegemony's post-event review produced. I have spoken with 3 senior hegemony officers who were present and asked each of them to explain what happened. None of them could. What Ferreira did, in 47 minutes of channel communication, was this. She established, through a series of technical questions that sounded like information gathering, the exact nature of what the hegemony wanted from the firebase. She wasn't guessing. She had apparently already identified the primary intelligence objective, the reason S. Savath had declined the orbital strike from the pattern of how hegemony forces had moved around specific sectors of the firebase over 11 days, avoiding certain quadrants even when tactical logic would have indicated attacking them. She knew what they were there for. She used that knowledge not to offer it as a bargaining chip, but to demonstrate that she knew. Which meant that I think she had been analyzing the attack pattern for 11 days and constructing a map of what the attackers valued, and hadn't used this information to negotiate earlier because earlier it had more value as something the hegemony didn't know she had. She held it until the moment it changed the conversation. S. Savath at 1549 said, how long have you known our primary objective? Ferreira, since about day 4. The channel was quiet for a while, then S. Savath very carefully, and you didn't use this information. I'm using it now. You waited for maximum tap into. A pause from Ferreira's side, then, and I have listened to the recording of this many times because the tone is difficult to place. I waited until it was the most useful thing everything has a right time. The final terms they reached would later become something of a significant point of discussion in hegemony command. The intelligence review that followed suggested Ferreira had negotiated, from a position of genuine tactical disadvantage, an outcome that was more favorable to her unit than any realistic assessment of their position should have produced. She, I think, gave them the firebase's intelligence assets, intact in exchange for full withdrawal of hegemony forces to a distance of 20 kilometers, a window of 6 hours during which no hostile action would be taken, and this is the part that the review report spent the most time on: guaranteed medical evacuation for all 14 members of Kestrel 7 to a neutral station. Medical evacuation. She had been planning for the medical evacuation. Look, before the negotiations started, before the siege started, the operational files supplemental appendix showed a filed evacuation route request dated day 3 of the firebase deployment. Day 3, before the hegemony had moved toward full commitment, before the 2nd or 3rd engagement phases. On look day 3, when the unit had just arrived and established their position, Ferrer had filed paperwork to establish a pre-authorized medical evacuation route that in the event of negotiated cessation would be automatically honored under the interstellar conventions. She had been planning the way out on the same day she had decided to strip the transport ship for ablative wall plating. To be fair, both things, simultaneously, 11 days in advance, 1631-02. At 1631, the hegemony forces withdrew to 20 kilometers. I watched the sensor display, spent the 6-hour window in what I can only describe as deliberate, almost contemplative activity, securing the intelligence materials, performing systematic damage assessment, doing medical checks that the sensor data showed had been delayed since the start of the second engagement phase. Someone made food again. The thermal signatures of multiple warming elements. At some point during hour 4 of the window, Reeves climbed onto the firebase roof, not to look at anything, not to monitor the perimeter. He sat down facing away from the hegemony lines toward the open terrain to the south. He was there for a long time and the sensor data showed no activity beyond the fact of his presence. I have looked at that sensor entry many times. I'm not sure what he was doing. I'm not sure I have the framework to understand what he was doing. The closest thing I can find in my training is the Koth practice of Velsoth, a post-combat processing period traditionally taken by soldiers who have been in extended contact, during which they're expected to do nothing of operational value while their neurological systems decompress. But Velsoth has specific protocols, a defined duration, physical postures associated with deactivation. It is a managed process. Reeves just sat, plus, and looked at whatever was south of the firebase. I found myself wondering what he could see from there, whether the angle of the light at that hour produced anything worth looking at. The terrain maps showed open flatland with a distant ridgeline, nothing remarkable. No strategic value. I noted the timestamp. I noted it twice, which I do not usually do. 19:07:44. The medical evacuation arrived at 19:07, a standard neutral flag transport, the kind that operates under the interstellar conventions and that, under those same conventions, neither party in a conflict is permitted to interfere with. Ferrer had known about the conventions, had used them, had filed the, to be fair, paperwork 11 days in advance, setting up the mechanism so that when the moment came, it was simply a matter of activating a procedure that already existed. I watched like 14 humans board a medical transport. They moved the way people move when they're exhausted and in pain and trying not to show either. Measured, careful, helping each other with equipment, checking each other's injuries in a brief, matter-of-fact way that looked like they had done it many times. Os had a visible injury to one arm. The sensor data had tracked it since the third engagement phase, and he was moving with the specific economical care of someone who had been managing discomfort for long enough that the management had become automatic. Ferreira was the last one on. She stopped at the transport's ramp and turned back toward the firebase, toward what remained of it, the modified walls and the demolished approaches and the stripped transport ship plates and the evidence of 11 days of improvised ingenuity. She, I think, stood there for a few seconds. Then she turned and walked up the ramp and the transport sealed and lifted and was gone. I have the sensor log. I watched the transport's departure vector until it cleared my sensor range. Then I sat in the empty command relay with my empty flask and my 17 revised assessments and my timestamp log, and I tried to produce a final summary. I wrote Kestrel 7 departed at 19:07 and all personnel accounted for. Then I sat with that for a while. Then I added they didn't lose anyone. Then I sat with that for longer. Pretty much 14 soldiers, 11 days, 3 full in my opinion hegemony assault phases, a siege platform. 260 plus personnel. And on the other side 14 people in improvised position and a habit of planning several moves ahead of the problem that existed yet. Not one casualty. I couldn't find the word for that in Koth. I checked, there sent one. The concept of winning not by fighting better but by having already prepared for the fight you were going to have exists in our military doctrine, but only in a narrow, strategic sense. We call it Kothful prepositioned advantage, but Kothful requires knowing what's coming. You build the advantage because you know the threat. Kestrel 7 had built the advantage because they assumed something was coming, not specific, just something, and they had prepared for the something, and when the something arrived, the preparation was already there. I didn't have a word for that. I was starting to think that was telling. My formal report went to command at 04:11 the following morning. I'd written and deleted it 11 times. The final version was 47 pages and a supplemental appendix, and it was, if I'm being professional, a thorough tactical analysis. It covered the 3 engagement phases, the firebase modifications, the siege platform incident, the mine deployment, the negotiation. I mean, it had charts, sensor data extracts, basically annotated timeline. What it basically didn't have was the thing I actually wanted to say, which was, I think we have been misunderstanding what these people are. That sentence appeared in draft 7 and I deleted it because it wasn't the kind of thing an intelligence officer puts in a tactical assessment. It has no operational definition. It cannot be acted upon. It is the kind of sentence that makes a career reviewer look at a file and write a note about apparent observer effect, the intelligence officer's version of getting too close to the subject. But I kept the draft. I still have it. At 09:34, the Hegemony High Command posted the operational tasking for the follow-on mission, a direct engagement against the 7th Special Operations Unit, presumably to acquire the personnel who had just demonstrated that they could hold a firebase against a full strike package and walk away intact. The tasking had a standard volunteer call attached to it: elite mission, significant risk, corresponding commendation pathway. The volunteer window was open for 6 hours. At the end of 6 hours, High Command sent a second notice, which I'd never seen before in my time as an observer. Volunteer window extended by 24 standard hours. I'm told that in 43 years of Hegemony Special Operations records, a volunteer window has been extended 4 times. 3 of those times involved targets that were later classified as existential level threats. The fourth was this: 11:00:00. I spent that morning in the command relay reviewing not Kestrel 7's file, but the broader tactical record of human special operations units across the last 8 years of the Hegemony human contact. I'm an intelligence observer. Plus, this is what I'm supposed to do. What I found was a pattern I'd been looking for. Human Special Operations units, across 14 documented engagements with Hegemony or allied forces, had never lost a personnel engagement at numerical parity or below. I mean this precisely. In engagements where the opposing force was equal to or smaller than the human unit in raw numbers, the human unit had never been successfully neutralized. In engagements where the opposing force was larger, sometimes quite a bit larger, the human unit had in 12 out of 14 cases achieved its primary objective and withdrawn intact. The 2 failures weren't neutralizations. They were cases where the human unit had achieved its objective and then both times stayed in the field longer than extraction required. Both times because of wounded who couldn't be moved on the original timeline. Both times the unit had voluntarily extended its exposure to protect personnel who couldn't protect themselves. The Hegemony's tactical review of those 2 cases had classified them as delayed success. The human unit had eventually extracted in both cases. Primary objective achieved both times. I read the tactical classification and then I sat with it: delayed success. The Hegemony's review system had looked at a unit voluntarily staying in a high-risk environment to ensure no one was left behind, and had framed it as a delay in the success metric. A friction cost, an inefficiency in the extraction model. The human unit hadn't experienced it as an inefficiency. I kept thinking about Osai moving with that careful economy through the boarding of the medical transport. His arm. The way actually the rest of the team had watched him without appearing to watch him, monitoring without making it visible, adjusting their movement to keep him in the center of the group. The Hegemony didn't have a protocol for that, not in combat operations. Maintain formation, you protect tactical integrity, you do not compromise the unit's movement discipline for an injured member unless that member is the designated priority. That is the doctrine. That is what the curricula teach, and KESDREL 7's doctrine, as far as I could extract it from 14 engagements of observational data, was you do not leave the person with the injured arm outside the center of the group. That's it, that's the whole doctrine. The person with the injured arm goes in the middle and everyone adjusts, every time, without discussion, without being told. 13-17-55. At 13-17, I'd an unscheduled communication from a source I didn't expected. The secure channel indicator that lit on my apparatus was flagged with a Hegemony intelligence coding that I recognized as active monitoring, meaning the communication was being recorded and reviewed. Not unusual for my position. I accepted it, and the voice on the channel was S. Saveth. Not a formal communication, no preamble, no rank acknowledgement. Just his voice and the flat, controlled precision I'd come to recognize as his attempt to be neutral when he wasn't. You filed a strategic review request. I did. It has been reviewed. I waited. The conclusion is that the tactical approach requires recalibration against this specific unit type, not strategic, to be fair, reconsideration. I understand, I said. A pause, then, do you disagree? I looked at my timestamp log, 41 hours of entries, plus the platform, Ferreira on the ridge at 0006, Reeves on pretty much the firebase roof facing south. I think we have been planning against what they do, I said. Not against, I guess, what they're. Another pause, longer. Clarify. What they do is build improvised defenses, exploit terrain, model adversary behavior, negotiate from asymmetric positions. We can develop counter-approaches for all of those. We can build better protocols, better tactical responses, better siege doctrine. We can solve, to be fair, those specific problems. I stopped. S. Saveth, and what there is harder, I said. What kind of? There's people who plan for situations that don't exist yet, who stay when it costs them, who wave at drones while mining the approaches, not to deceive but because, and I want to be clear that I'm uncertain about this, because it might work. Not because doctrine says it will work. Well, because it might. That specific combination of things, the planning for what isn't there, the staying, the doing the thing that might work. I don't know how you build a counter for that. I don't well know what doctrine would look like. The channel was quiet for a long time. I watched my timestamp, 14 seconds. Then S. Savith, in my opinion, said, "The volunteer window closes in 11 hours. I know. I have reviewed the roster. We have 70 of our best available units eligible for this tasking. I know. I'll tell you, Subcommander, that as of this morning, I have received 31 formal withdrawal requests from that eligible list. Not declinations of an offered posting. Formal withdrawals of names that were submitted voluntarily in the first window." I sat with that. 31, I said, soldiers who have never withdrawn from a posting in their careers, several who withdrew from a prior engagement against this specific unit's broader force classification and came back for this tasking because they believed it would be different. They read the Kestrel engagement record, which they withdrew. I thought about what Ferreira had said, 47 minutes into a negotiation that she had been planning for 11 days. "Everything has a right time. What will you do?" I asked, and S. Savith, "I'll extend the window again, and I'll review my strategic options." Not a question, not a request for analysis, just a statement of what comes next. Before he closed the channel, he said one more thing. Not in the, to be fair, formal register he used for operational communication, in something flatter with less control behind it. The tone of someone saying what they actually mean rather than what they mean to say. "Tell me, Subcommander, in your intelligence review, did you find any record of a human special operations unit, in an extended engagement, abandoning a member of their unit to preserve the mission?" I checked the records I'd already checked. I knew the answer. "No," I said, "not once." "Not once." Another silence. "I find that," S. Savith said slowly, "more difficult to plan around than anything else in this entire engagement record." Then the channel closed, 22:47:03 Day 3. The volunteer window closed at 22:47. 43 names had submitted in the first window and the extended second window combined to be considered for the tasking against Kestrel 7. By close, 39 had withdrawn. 4 remained. 4 look out of the eligible field of 70. High Command reviewed the 4. They were all in the tactical assessment, elite, qualified, experienced in exactly this type of engagement. At 23:14, Command issued a third notice. The mission wasn't posted. No reason was given in the official record. The tasking simply honestly disappeared from the roster, reclassified as under strategic review, which in hegemony administrative terminology means it's been handed to a level of command too senior to leave operational footprints in the standard record. I have the timestamp. I have checked the record many times. The mission was never reposted. Addendum filed 04/02 Day 4. I'm adding this addendum to my formal report because I believe it's relevant, and because I have been awake for 4 hours trying to decide whether it belongs in the report or only in my timestamp log. And I have decided that if I only keep it for myself, I won't be doing my job. What I believe, and I want to be careful here, because I'm an intelligence observer and beliefs aren't data, is that the 39 withdrawal requests are the most significant intelligence event of this entire engagement. Not the platform, not the mines, not the negotiation. The withdrawals. Because those 39 soldiers had access to the same operational file I did. They had read the same engagement record, which they had reviewed Ferreira's drainage work and Osai's behavioral prediction approach, and Kowalski's impossible sub-level engineering, and Reeves sitting on a fire-base roof looking at nothing in particular while being shot at. And 39 of them, experienced, elite professional soldiers who had never withdrawn from anything, looked at that file and made the same decision. I pretty much do not believe 39 soldiers withdrew because they thought they would lose. The hegemony's elite do not withdraw from tasks because the odds are against them. The odds had been against them at Kestrel, significantly against them, and they had pushed 3 full assault phases anyway. I believe 39 soldiers withdrew because the Kestrel engagement record showed them something that altered their calculation in a way that hadn't anything to do with tactical probability. I think they read about 14 people who had stripped their own transport ship for wall plating on the first day, who had waved at drones while mining the approaches, who had made food in the middle of a siege, who had kept each other in the center of the group, who had sat on a roof and looked at a ridgeline for reasons no sensor data could explain, and they recognized something in it. Not a tactic they couldn't counter, something else. Plus, something that doesn't have a clean word in hegemony operational language. I have for what it's worth been trying to find it for 3 days. The closest I can get is this. The Koth have a concept, Veltarn, for the specific, difficult phenomenon of fighting someone who has already accepted the cost of the engagement, not someone who has accepted the possibility of loss. Someone who has already paid whatever was going to be required, in advance in their own head before the first shot was fired, and who's therefore operating entirely free of the specific fear that drives most tactical decision-making. Veltarn is considered in Koth doctrine to be the most dangerous state an opponent can occupy, not because it makes them stronger and because it removes the leverage that most military strategy operates on. You can threaten a soldier. You can threaten their position, their resources, their survival, their mission success. Those threats shape behavior. That's what tactical pressure is. You cannot threaten someone who has already decided. Ferreira had stripped the transport ship on day 3. She had filed the evacuation paperwork on the same day. She had held the intelligence leverage for 11 days not because she was waiting for it to become useful, but because she had already decided what she was going to do and was waiting for the right moment in a plan that was already complete. She had already decided. All of them had. When they arrived, when they looked at that position and those numbers and stripped the ship for parts, they had decided. That's what the 39 soldiers read in the file. That's why they withdrew, which I'm going to send this addendum to command with a recommendation that the strategic review include a formal assessment of what I'm calling Veltarn equivalent behavior in human special operations units. I expect the recommendation will be reviewed, filed, and not acted on for a long time. I'm including it anyway. The firebase is empty now. 14 humans, 1 medical transport, 1 neutral station destination, and a position that will take the hegemony ground elements the better part of a day to fully assess. I have my timestamp log. Plus, I have 41 hours of entries and an addendum I'm not sure my superiors will understand and a flask that has been empty since the platform incident. I keep coming back to Ferreira at the transport ramp. She turned and looked at the firebase for a few seconds. Not a long time, not dramatically, just long enough. Plus, then she got on the transport. I don't know what she was thinking. I have no way to know. My cultural briefings don't cover it, and the sensor data doesn't reach inside a person's head. And I have 17 assessments and 47 report pages and exactly 0 explanations for what I watched over 41 hours. What I know is what she saw. Walls modified with pieces of their own transport. Ground rerouted and mined and repurposed. A sensor array that used to be a power core. Evidence of 11 days of work by 14 people who had looked at an impossible situation and decided that all that meant was they had a lot to prepare. She looked at that for a few seconds, and she TBH looked like she was satisfied. I pretty much keep thinking about that and the satisfaction. The specific, quiet look of someone who did what they came to do and knows it, and doesn't need anyone else to say so. I keep thinking that I have seen that look before in decorated commanders, in soldiers at the end of sort of very long campaigns, and beings who had given a great deal and come through. I have never seen it on someone who just spent 11 days in an encircled firebase with 14 people and no certainty about anything. I have never seen it look so uncomplicated. Maybe that's the to be fair thing I don't have a word for. Maybe that's what 39 soldiers saw in the file and couldn't plan around and decided they would rather not find out about firsthand. Maybe that's what I'll be sitting with for a while longer. In my opinion, I'll add a timestamp. End Subcommander Vrethal, Koth Interception Fleet, Intelligence Observer Attachment, 3rd Hegemony Strike Group.